Hello and welcome to the webinar. This one's on risk-based alerting, the frontier of enterprise security, part of our Splunk bite-sized security series. This is webinar number 3, if you haven't seen the first 2. So what are we talking about today? Well, we're going to start again, like the last one, on SIS controls and really why this is useful, why risk-based alerting is an approach that should be useful, why RBA and the risk framework, how that kind of comes together, why the risk framework as being a fundamental framework of enterprise security, the vital questions again, just to make sure that we have a successful implementation. What do we need to have in place? How to configure, use it, and then we'll also have a look at it as well. We'll go through a demonstration of it all. So that's the plan. So first off, let's look at the couple of SIS controls that are relevant to here. So we've got SIS control 13, which is network monitoring and defense. Operate processes, tooling to establish and maintain comprehensive network monitoring and defense against security threats across the enterprise network infrastructure and user base. So really just having SIEM kind of concepts in place. Centralized security alert event alerting 13.1. So making sure that we have a SIEM and everything comes into one place. That's kind of the sort of basis of having a SIEM really. And then second, we've got the CIS control 17, which is incident response management, being able to kind of correlate information together to be able to detect, quickly respond to an attack and have more information at the fingertips. So that's the reasons for it, right? So why RBA? Well, as opposed to the ordinary sort of notable kind of events or security incidents directly, well, essentially because we're seeing this out in the wild, more and more SOCs are being overwhelmed with the amount of alerts. And what that really leads to is abandoned alerts, suppressed alerts, slow detection and response, and analyst burnout and turnover of staff, unfortunately. So really, there needs to be a better way of doing it. And RBA hopefully is there to the rescue to kind of reduce a lot of that noise and make it a lot better. So how does it really work? Well, first off, what we do is we take correlations, same as what we did previously, things that we want to be interested in, suspicious behavior, should we say, and then instead of directly alerting on it, we now class it as an observation. We observe this fact and send it into a risk index. So we collect that information as a subset of the data that's already there, right? And we're seeing the suspicious information. We then apply risk scores to it. We apply annotations to it, whether that's the MITRE ATT&CK annotations, and really we're looking for all those outliers of the standard behavior. And that then we look at inside the risk index to see collections or correlations of behavior, known or bad behavior or against policy behavior or suspicious behavior. And essentially what we then do is we alert on top of that. So if we see everything and it's all tied to a particular entity, whether that's a user or a device, and then we start applying risk to that, and then when it gets to a certain threshold, we alert on it. So how does this look in practice? Well, multiple events. Okay, so at 9:55, maybe we got a potential spear phishing observed. Now, do we know that anything's actually occurred there? Is it a security incident or is it just something that's happened, right? Let's add in 10 points to the risk. All right, now at 1:23 p.m., so quite a bit later, there's some software that's been running on this particular device, right? So we've applied risk to the device. We've now got another 20 points of risk because something that we've maybe not seen before has started running in this device. Then a minute later, basically, another command's being run, disabling certain security controls. Okay, well, okay, it's starting to get a little bit, well, a lot more risky, really. We've got to about 50 points right now. Then we see some PowerShell that's suspicious. Then we see a service being installed. Okay, well, we're at 90 points. And then at 2:15 p.m., we see suspicious lateral movement. Okay, so over time, we've now accumulated enough to say, right, I want to alert on this. I want my analysts to spend their time, because their time is precious, to spend their time investigating what's going on here. Okay, so now because we're over 100 points, what we do is we have a risk incident rule. So anything that's over 100 points in a 24-hour period, as in this one, then we send an alert. And that's just straight to the analyst there for investigation. What this really means is two things, right? First, we have far more coverage, right? We can do a lot more use cases in this way than we could in a direct notable because there just was too much noise, okay? But we can also present back very much higher fidelity alerts when they come back to them. So an analyst will see all of this information about this asset and know instantly that, Okay, there's a lot of bad things going on. Maybe we need to lock the asset down or whatever. Or even you can send that into automation because you've got a lot better confidence in the actual alert itself. So this is how it works. So that's great. So what's the most important things to rethink about, right? So we obviously need to think about what score we need to apply to each rule. We need to think about what thresholds or measures we're interested in. Now, this isn't always just a score threshold, right? It doesn't have to be 100 points, and I'll show you in the demo. In fact, other ways of doing it. It could be the number of tactics that are involved. It could be the number of different use cases or searches that have kind of triggered. If the same search triggers over and over again and hits a threshold, that's probably not as interesting as something where multiple different techniques or tactics have been involved. Okay, so there's lots of different things that we can do there, and we can do combinations of these. One of the ones I saw very recently at .conf is the concept, very makes a lot of sense really, is using an analytics story. And if you ever see all the different correlation searches that trigger over an analytics story, then alert on it, right? So lots of different ways of creating these alerts. It doesn't have to be tied down to a particular score, but scoring is obviously the sort of baseline kind of level, should we say. We also need to think about what correlation rules are ideal for risk-based alerting and which ones do we actually want a notable alert for, right? Because if we want a notable event directly because it's really known bad and it shouldn't happen at all, then that's fine. That's not a problem. Not everything has to go into risk-based alerting, and in a lot of cases, what you'll actually have is a number of alerts, a large number of alerts that go just far into risk-based alerting. Some alerts that do both, and then which you want to alert and give you more context behind, and then some alerts that are just a direct notable, just deal with them as they are individually and don't need any sort of background to them. So it's just kind of going through all of your use cases and figuring out which ones are good for which side really. So the risk framework, this is kind of how it sets up. So basically what we do is we create correlation searches. Those correlation searches then create an event, okay, a notable event. They trigger an alert. That adaptive response action is then used as a risk adaptive response action, and that produces risk and applies it into the risk index. It's a summary index, basically. There is then a data model that sits on top of it for the risk data model, and essentially that will kind of extract all the information out there, and that's what we look upon, that accelerated data model, to be able to alert on, use our risk indicator rules. Now, this can also feed back. Security analysts will be able to see different things going on. They could do threat hunting within the risk info. They don't have to wait for an actual alert. And when they find anything in there, then they can send an ad hoc risk entry into the index if they want to. At any point throughout that sort of timeline, they can go and add in ad hoc risk entries. So that's another way of adding into the risk framework. One app that's kind of really important in this, and similar in the sense to what the previous webinar was on, right? This one's about SA threat intelligence. This is where we contain all the risk stuff out of the box. It's a supporting application, which is the SA piece of an enterprise security build. So you'll see it in Splunk Cloud, you'll see it on-prem. And inside here, it contains the risk data model, it contains all the out-of-the-box risk searches, risk indicator rules, and it contains the risk dashboards as well as macros and everything else. So this is really the kind of place that you want to have a look if you want to kind of go through all the risk side of things. So with that, let's go and actually have a look at it. So we're starting here in the all configurations page, specifically in that SA threat intelligence application, and we're going to see everything that's created in the app with the term risk, right? So we can see the saved searches. These are the top two of the out-of-the-box risk indicator rules. Okay, so these are the things that are creating notable events. We can see all the different risk kind of saved searches that go on in the background. We can see macros that are doing things as well. We can see ways of applying macros to users or so forth, so that fields are extracted that says user risk and stuff like that, include the lookups. So you can see that risk being applied. So you get a constant update in your searches where risk is there. What's the level of risk for this particular thing? So all that. So if you want to have a look a little bit more detail about what's in there, then that's the sort of place to see. So there's 54 items you could look through. Now, where I want to start this kind of journey through risk is really about how we can start thinking about what sort of risk we want. Now, Splunk Security Essentials is written with risk concepts in mind. So you can actually find content. You can click on find content. You can go to risk-based alerting content across the right-hand side, and then you can pick the particular category of content that you're looking for. Maybe it's compliance, maybe it's application security, security monitoring, and this will take you to your security data, your security content in Splunk Security Essentials, with all the things that are really useful for risk. Okay, so it's filtering down to those risk relevant kind of use cases that can be useful for correlating against other information. That's probably one of the ways to think about it. Risk is really about correlating with other sort of types of events that might be occurring, right? So you get presented back with this, as you would expect from Splunk Security Essentials. Another way of looking at this is if you go to Analytics Advisor, go to risk-based alerting content recommendations, then you can filter down again either to the content that's available to you or to all content. Okay, and you can filter down on specific applications and certain categories. So in this case, I've gone to cloud security, and maybe I'm presented back with all those security content that might be useful for cloud security in a risk kind of way. Okay, so that's another way of getting through the content. So that's one of the kind of important things to consider in the process. Now, if you want to then go into it, what you can see is in correlation searches in Splunk Enterprise Security. So if you come into configure, into content management, and then filter based on correlation searches and enabled, you can see what's actually running. So here I've got some ES content update searches. This one's AWS console login by user from a new city. So if I look in detail at this actual search, I can see it's a normal correlation search. There's nothing sort of groundbreaking out of here. It's looking for anything that's in a new city from historical events, but it's also then providing a lot of annotations. So we're annotating with the SIS-20 controls, the kill chain, the meta attack, the NIST, the confidence and impact scores, and these are really good at kind of, if you can give an idea of what your impact and your confidence of each use case that you've got running, that can be a really good way of deciding what score you should be applying. And there's a blog on our website about kind of aligning those two together to make a good actual risk score, because it's always an idea of like, how do I risk score at the beginning? So just something to bear in mind. You can also see the other annotations in terms of what analytics story is relevant to and so forth, right? So that runs on a particular time window, and in this case, it's not throttling at all, but in some cases you might want to throttle. It depends on kind of how you want to play with your risk scores, your risk use cases, right? Sometimes you might be wanting to observe if it's got internet connection or something like that. Sometimes you want to observe something else. And then what we're doing was the adaptive response action. So down here, we've got risk analysis. We've got a user. The username is logging into the AWS console from a city for the first time. Okay, and their risk score is applying 18 points to that user field. Okay, so that's been defined obviously based on the confidence score and the impact score, how much we want to be applying. And this risk message is really important. Okay, so if you are doing risk for the first time, do make sure you put a risk message in, and if you can, put any threat objects in, because they can kind of tie everything together as well, so they can be really useful. So one other thing that you can do is a risk factor editor, right? So in terms of risk factors, what you can do is add risk based on certain conditions, right? So in this case, if that user is an administrator, so if I've got a user in there, it's got 18 points of risk at the moment, but if that user is an admin, i.e. they've got a privileged category of user from my asset identity list, right? Then we can times that factor by 1.5. So it'll actually give 27 points of risk, right? An extra 9 points added on, because that's what it should do, because that's a privileged account. We want to increase the risk. We want to know about any privileged accounts being used in this source. So this risk factor editor has a way of just dynamically altering the risk that's being applied out of a rule on its own based on certain conditions, whether that's a contractor, whether it's a critical priority destination, whatever it is that we're interested in, or maybe their watch list, that sort of thing. Then we can add an increased risk or decrease risk if we need to, right? So there's a multiplication, addition, or of course you can multiply by 0.5 to delete and so forth, right? So that's how we can do the risk factor editors. They can be a dynamic addition to it. And then once we've got all those correlation rules set up, they're all applying risk. We'll see that data in the index equals risk. So let's have a quick look at that, because so if I go index equals risk, I'll see within here all the different risk events that are being generated, right? So we're taking note of all these different things. They're all got a particular stash source type, right, which is our summary source type from Splunk out of the box. And we can see all the different sources, which are the risk rules that have been applied and triggered, right? So lots of different things going on in this environment. So we can search through that, and we can also pin, of course, to the risk object. So we want to browse around particular risk objects, what's been creating our risk on this particular risk object, can go into that, and we can go into our sources. Okay, so these three things are occurring on this particular asset, sort of thing, right? So we can browse that data. It is just sitting there. So if we want to go threat hunting into risk, we can do that. And of course, what we then do is we want to alert on it, right? When certain thresholds are hit. So what we have here is a couple of risk indicator rules. One's called attack tactic threshold exceeded for object over previous 7 days. There's also a 24-hour risk rule as well. So this is a 7-day risk rule, which is looking in the data model for risk, okay? And it's alerting if there's at least 3 tactics from the MITRE involved, at least 4 sources, right? So if I looked in the data itself, I can see annotations.MITRE attack, and the tactics and techniques of data fields that are in there because of the annotations that are in the correlation search themselves. And when I then hit that trigger, what I actually then do is create my notable. And it's at this point that it goes into incident review. I've given it my title, my description, I've got to drill down and all the sort of normal things that you would have from, you know, your previous kind of notable events and how you would normally previously alert. So that can all be done from there. And you could make these up for different things, right? And you could weight these things. And if you follow Hayley Mills' kind of journey to learning how to implement risk-based alerting, right? She's got a 4-stage journey. Some of the things she talks about is about having dynamic risk that you can apply in risk rules, but also having weighted sources and weighted tactics. And what we mean by that is not all risk rules should apply the same source. Maybe you've got brute force, maybe that's not so interesting, maybe excessive failed logins, maybe that's not so interesting, whatever it is. So you can reduce the weight of that particular source so that it doesn't hit the threshold, whereas some sources should count as a full 1 point, some maybe even 2 points towards that source count. So, you know, each source could be a little bit different in that weighting as well. So it's another way of just kind of looking in interesting ways. Yeah, so that's the kind of risk indicator rules. And so when that then alerts, what you then see is an incident review, you'll see events that are presented like this. And these are known as risk notables. You can filter based on type. So in this case, drill down to type risk notable. And then you'll get presented with all of them back, and you can see the risk events and the risk score. So in this case, I'm going to just expand this one to start with to show you that now that because it's a risk event, I can see all of the MITRE details, the annotations across the top, so I can get a much quicker insight into what's actually occurring with this particular asset in this case, because that's the risk object. So I can see all the different things that are going on there. I can get all that sort of useful key information down the left-hand side and anything that's going on the right. This one's actually gone directly to SOAR and actually been triaged in some respects already, which is why it's in progress. And then if I click on risk events, I'll get a pop-up here, which will show me all of the risk events, all the risk rules that have triggered related to this particular device. Okay, so here we can see 6 different risk rules here. Over a time period, we can zoom in further into that or zoom out, of course. So these are the risk events, and if I scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see all of those individually. And this, when I mentioned why risk messages are really important, because this is what's actually read by the analyst, really. So just making sure there's good detail in there, making sure it shows what processes or what objects are that's actually occurred to indicate that this is a risky instance. And you can see the risk rules, so what that's actually triggered, and the annotations as well on the right there. You can filter that down or of course expand it with a little bit more detail. And then also at the top right, you can go into the threat topology. And this is where we can really link things between threat objects and risk objects. We can get a little bit more detail around what's going on. So you can see these things are linked together. So this laptop's also linked to be stole. So you can see lots of good kind of insight, overview of what's actually going on across the top. And of course the assets and in the asset list across the top there as well. So jolly good. So that gives us a lot more insight into what's actually going on. Our analyst can go, yes, this is no bad, I want to lock it down. I can go ahead and run my adaptive response action, come in here, run an adaptive response action from here, and block it or whatever. Or if it's pumping out into SOAR, you can get that kind of automated as it goes through processes and so forth. So whatever we need to do, we can do a particular direct adaptive response from there. And then finally, if you really want to look into it, what you have is under security intelligence risk analysis. And this will go into detail about all the things that are going in risk in the environment, right? So we've got risk scores by objects. You can see the high objects. You can see most active sources. And this is probably one of the most important used dashboard panels. You probably want to expand it out and have a look over it to see where your risk is being applied. So if you come in here and click search, then that will give you a good idea. And then across the top, you can also see all the different annotations and threat objects that are involved across my risk. And you can filter everything down as you need to, change the time window. And then right at the bottom, you can see all the modifiers individually in a tabular format, right? But again, this is just looking at that data in the index itself. So you can go ahead and have a look and browse through it that way. But this is, as I say, one of the most useful ones because it gives you kind of direction about, okay, well, it's not particularly hitting many risk objects, but it's applying a lot of risk. It's just repeating itself. Maybe it's running too often. Maybe it needs a bit of thresholding. Can kind of give you some direction of where you want to be thinking about tuning this in this kind of space. Okay, with that, thank you very much for attending. Hopefully that bite-sized information on risk-based alerting was useful for you all. If you do want to find out any more or have any questions, just email info@somerfordassociates.com. And if you missed the webinar, you can go to youtube.com and find us there. Yeah, hopefully you'll join us on the fourth one, or join Stu in that case, on our fourth episode in the series, looking at the threat intelligence side of things and the threat framework.